Hello and welcome to this mini tutorial. Today I'm going to be looking at controlling particle emission and how we can adjust our particle systems to behave well for various looks. In this basic particle system, I have some particles being emitted from two flat disks, which are then pushed upward and twisted around a central axis before fading away. This is a nice effect, but with my current setup we can see when I restart the scene, we get a short surge of particles at the beginning, which take a second to fade out before our effect is fully generated. For this scene, I want a consistent rate of particle emission from beginning to end, so if I want to set up our particle emission correctly, the first step is to enable show metrics in the particle route and see what's going on. Here we can see each emitter, how many particles they want to use, and how many particles they are currently using. Now if I reset the playhead and press play, we can clearly see what the phenomena is. Our primitive emitters are hitting their maximum count quickly and can't emit any more until some of the other particles have died off. In the primitive emitters, I can go to the emitter properties to try and identify what's going on. You might think that raising the max particle count would give more of an overhead, but our emitters emit based on this value, so they will just attempt to emit more particles faster. We need to look at the other emission properties to understand why our particles are behaving this way. There are three main properties which control particle emission and lifespan. Particle life, which controls how long the particles live for. The particle life randomness, which reduces the particle life by a random amount. And the emission rate, which controls how quickly particles are emitted. A longer particle life means the particles will be in the scene longer on average, so the emitter will be more likely to meet the max particle count over time. As we can see here, as I raise this value, our particles hit the max particle count earlier now, because the older particles haven't been killed off yet. Conversely, lowering the particle life means the particles will die sooner on average, and we won't meet that max particle count anymore. Life randomness is also having a heavy contribution to the effect. It's quite high by default, which for this scene means most of the particles are dying off before they ever reach the top. This is also why we can see a slight gradient of density from the bottom to the top. If I lower the randomness and reset the scene, more particles will live for longer in the scene, and we can see a much clearer block of particles. Raising the randomness past 1 means that some of the particles are emit and die immediately, so anything higher than 0.95 tends to lead to a lot of wasted particles. Finally, the emission rate just controls how quickly particles are generated. Higher emission rates mean more particles being emit, and when set too high means reaching the max particle count and creating that block again. Too low, and again we have a ton of particles which aren't being emit. This isn't necessarily a problem, just a less efficient system with some particles going unused. In this scene, I can set it to a low value, and we can see that the emitter particle count approaches the max particle count but doesn't reach it, so the block of particles no longer appears. In most cases, the trick to particle emission is finding the right balance between these options, so that the current particle count gets close to but never reaches the max particle count. Even if you're making an effect where you plan to animate these values, making sure that you stay hovering around or just below the max particle count means that your particle system will be as optimal as possible with consistent particle emission throughout your effect. Now we can see that by lowering the emission rate, we've thinned out our particles a little bit, which isn't necessarily what we wanted to do. Now, the nature of particle emission means that we're going to have to just raise that max particle count in order to get back up to the density we had before, but fortunately only by a little bit. Finally, I think it's worth mentioning the pre-roll time in the particle route. If you can't find the right balance and you want your particles to be ready and moving at the beginning of your frame, it can often be necessary to set the particle animation to pre-roll a few seconds before being activated. This means any anomalies at the start of your scene will have time to balance into the final effect, and your particles will appear in your scene already animating. Now that our particle emission is set up, we can play with some particles and add some effectors, knowing that the emitters will hold up my effect properly. Anyway, that's it for this mini tutorial. I hope you find this helpful, and I'll see you again in the next one.